Rutgers Scarlet Knights fans, it's Larry K, your host for Night Watch, with a bye week episode this week. And I have a very special guest for you. I figured, what can I do for the bye week that's going to be interesting for our listeners, that's going to give you legitimate content from a legitimate source, a guy who has put me on several times and is quite knowledgeable about the whole league, right? Because it's the bye week for us, but the rest of the league continues to spin. The world continues to turn. We are 2-0, but we haven't played a conference game yet. Some teams have played some conference games. And we want to get a kind of feel about how the conference is looking and where Rutgers' position could be in it, amongst other things. So without further ado, I want to bring my good friend Zack Gugenheim of Big Ten Football Talk onto the show. And Zack, welcome to the show, my bro. I've been on yours plenty of times, but this is the first time you're on Night Watch.
I'm so excited to be on Night Watch with you. And Larry, we've got some we've had some bangers over at on my show, and I'm excited for another one here. I was telling my wife that I was coming on to your show, and she's like, "I feel like Larry's my good friend. Like you are the first." So I've done almost 200 episodes, and I think our episode this past time when we were talking about Rutgers over preseason was the first full episode she listened to. And she's like, I want to be really good friends with this guy. And I'm like, I am really good friends with this guy, and you should be. So, but I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, that's great stuff. And I mean, I think both of us kind of have that friendly persona. That's why we get listeners and whatnot. So I'm happy that the wife listened and is into it. And I'm happy to have you on. Obviously, credit my boy Sean for kind of linking us up, saying, hey, you got to listen to this guy, Zack. You got to get on his show. And the rest is history, man. The rest is history. So let's start off with, we know you're an Ohio State fan. So let's just hear your take on, I mean, and there's not so much we could glean so far per se, but current thoughts on OSU before we jump into the rest of the league a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I try to be as objective as possible, and I often try to actually treat Ohio State with an anti-bias because I just it's just very easy to be like, well, Ohio State's going 12-0 every year, and I was really hard for me because especially with some of the scarring from Michigan the past few years. But I picked Ohio State to win the league, which I was like, I don't like this. I don't know how I feel about Will Howard. I don't know how I feel about Chip Kelly. So I had a lot of concerns. And week one, I saw a lot of good things. I actually was at that game when they played Akron. And, the offense was a little out of sorts. But, you saw good things. Their game against Western Michigan, who, granted, Western Michigan, a MAC team, but they had just given Wisconsin all they could handle. I mean, they took Wisconsin to the fourth quarter. I don't think Wisconsin's that good, but we'll talk about them later. But what really impressed me about Ohio State this past week, I haven't seen run blocking like this in 5 years. And it's the offensive line. They're still down their best offensive lineman and Donovan Jackson. He'll be back probably after the bye week this week. They're building depth. The perimeter blocking is better than it's been, I think, since Urban Meyer left.
Wow.
So, again, everything's in context, but by the way, they have a receiver who might be as good, if not better than Marvin Harrison right now, and Jeremiah Smith. And I have tried to, not pump, I've tried to pump the brakes on the hype for a long time because I've been hearing he'll be wide receiver 1. He'll be this in 2 weeks from a measurable standpoint, right? He is faster than Marv. I think he's more physical than Marv. He's a freshman. He's made freshman mistakes. So, I mean, as a polished product, not as good as Marvin Harrison was. But in terms of what he's done in the first 2 games, over 200 yards, 3 touchdowns, is clearly the go-to guy for Will Howard.
Which is interesting, which is crazy.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a guy who's got Emeka Ibuka, who's going to be a first-round pick.
Right.
Carnell Tate, who's no snub. He's no scrub. Brandon Inniss, he'd be probably wide receiver 1 at 100 schools.
Right. I mean, this is Ohio State. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so uh, and what's crazy is as much as I'm talking about run blocking and everything, they're clearly the second best unit on the team. Like the
Mhm,
defense is as good as advertised,
mhm.
and defensive line is eating in a way I haven't seen them eat. And again, MAC teams, but they're dominating when in years past they have not dominated like this
Right,
against lesser competition. So, all that said, do I think that they have a lot to prove still? Yes. Like, and I think there are teams in this league that can certainly beat them. But if they play the way that they played against Western Michigan week in, week out, nobody's beating them in the league.
right. Wow, that's a bold prediction from somebody who I can attest, and you guys out there who listen to Big Ten football talk in general can attest as an objective observer. That's big stuff. I mean, and that's something to keep an eye on for the rest of the season. Let me ask you about the uh what they'd call and I lower tier competition. And I say that, not in a condescending way, but just in a kind of
Sure.
objective way that we all know. I mean, do you think sometimes, like as you just said, you can glean something from Ohio State's performance, even versus these MAC teams? And, in previous seasons, you've seen tweaks you wanted to, work on and whatnot. Rutgers got off to a kind of a slow start against Akron this week, and then obviously ran away with it. And same the week before with Howard, which obviously Howard's a BCS school, FCS school. Um, with lower tier competition, I mean, what can you glean early in seasons? And you're somebody who watches the whole league. Can you glean a whole lot from, first halves of games, or are you really just looking at the execution of the team you're watching? Does it do any good to compare? Oh, this team had a decent outing against another Power Five team last week, but this week they didn't. I mean, how much should we be reading into that, both in because I've seen people, right, Zach? Rutgers fans want to read into our game one way or the other, or don't
Mhm.
want to read into it, but then they'll turn around and say, "Oh, look what's happening, to this conference rival against so and so. We're gonna surely beat them." This and that. A lot of talk
Yeah.
about VTech. The first week one and Vandy, and how much stock. And I know Vandy's a Power Five, but how much
Yeah.
stock do we put into this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it really depends on where your program is at. So, like, I think there's probably a significant difference between Ohio State and Rutgers, for
Of
instance.
course,
And now Rutgers just they beat the brakes off of Akron this week too. So, you know, Rutgers is definitely ascending. I think, but for Ohio State, it's more like I was like upset by the first half
hmm
against Akron, but it was more just because they were just not lackadaisical. They weren't executing well,
right?
and they were executing poorly in all the ways that we have seen them execute poorly in years past.
Understood.
And so I think as an Ohio State guy, I'm like, I would be frustrated. Like I'm frustrated because they're making the same mistakes. That being said, I think what I saw in the second half was a correction, and they were starting to work on those things and gel a little bit. And what I saw in the second game with them is they weren't undisciplined,
Right.
like which has been, I think, a hallmark of Ryan Day team. No offense to Ryan Day,
hmm
but they've been undisciplined, and that has been a huge, I think, talking point. And they've been a little uncreative in offensive play calling. And that was not the case at all in the second half against Akron, and certainly not against Western Michigan. And before people bring up penalties, that was one of the worst officiating crews I've ever seen.
And that
I
does
mean,
happen.
yeah,
Whether the
I,
officiating is just terrible. That does
they
happen.
they
Frustrating
called
as it is.
they called a targeting penalty on Denzel Burke. Every single member of the broadcast crew, including Dean Blandino, who's the rules expert, is like,
Mhm.
"Oh, this isn't targeting," and then they call it targeting, and you're like,
Just unbelievable.
how do you do that? Like it, and that don't get me started on that. But so I think for a team like Ohio State, it's, are you focused? So,
Mhm.
I'll compare them to Penn State this past week and Oregon as well. Like Oregon has looked, I don't want to say lackadaisical, but they have just not looked sharp.
Right.
The offensive line has been a Siev for,
Mhm.
they've allowed a ton of sacks. The defense was abysmal against Ashton Gianti of Boise State.
Mhm.
And it's been 2 weeks in a row, and I think what you wanna see out of them is, like, it doesn't matter if they win by 10 or 40. What you wanna see is, are they explosive?
Right.
Can they sustain drives?
Right.
Are they crisp? And they haven't been. Penn State, after a big win, can they get back up? Their defense was terrible in the first half
Yeah, and
against
I
Bowling
mean,
Green.
that was a upset alert type thing in the first half there, and it was like that was a legitimate back and forth type game, and their
Yeah,
defense was just I mean, you're looking at the kid playing quarterback for Bowling Green, and you're thinking, look what might happen to Penn State here. I
yeah,
wanna kinda get a big picture because 'cause we're going down that road anyway. Being a Big Ten, league-wide commentator and having your show, you've seen, a couple games, and no one we had one conference game, and I'll ask you about that, but we've had a lot of out of conference games, some against stout competition, a lot against non stout competition. What have you seen in terms of? You don't have to go through every team, but has your
yeah,
perspective changed more positively or more negatively for any team that you've seen in the Big Ten so far through these first 2 weeks?
yeah. So I'll give a caveat by saying it's week 2, so I don't wanna overreact because teams grow, teams evolve.
Right.
And so we have to look at it from the lens of where they are right now, but also be thinking, okay, what has to happen for them to improve? So I'll start by saying this. I still think the league can be really competitive with the SEC at the top.
Hmm.
What I saw this past week is there's a lot more work to do to get there.
Right. Okay.
And so like Penn State, I was very high on them after their week 1 win against West Virginia. West Virginia, I think underrated team, good offense, underrated quarterback in Garrett Green, and Penn State just went in and just beat them up. And you're thinking, okay, they're really good. They've really figured out defense. Drew Aller has fire to them.
Yeah.
And they have some receivers that can get separation. Harrison Wallace played really well in that game. And then all of a sudden, week 2, Harrison Wallace doesn't have a catch. Drew Aller kind of looks like Drew Aller of old.
Right.
The defense doesn't look like one of the best defenses in the Big Ten. Um, and now the question is, were they sleepwalking? Who is the real Penn State? And I think that's a question I have. I think USC, uh, great win in Vegas against LSU.
Yeah, you
But
predicted that, right? I mean, I kind of thought LSU might have the edge, and that was your call, and sure enough,
yeah,
LSU comes through.
yeah, and I think it was a great win for USC. But I think to your credit, Larry, I think, and USC fans would disagree with me on this. I thought USC was the better coached team,
Mm. Mm.
clearly.
Mhm.
I don't know if I would agree that they were the more talented team yet.
Right. Right.
Yet. And I think that offensive line for LSU, I thought they really stunk down the stretch, but if
Mhm.
you watch them for the first 3 quarters of that game, they were easily the better line.
Right.
But I think USC kinda punched up above their weight class,
Yes.
and I thought played really well. Danton Lynn, by the way, amazing hire for
Mhm.
them, defensive coordinator. It's got those boys flying around, and so, like, I think USC, I think they can continue to grow into their talent, but are they a top 10 team? Are they a top 15 team?
Right.
I wouldn't feel comfortable putting them up in the top 10 yet. Um, and part of it is I don't think there's enough data. Um,
Right.
so like USC, Michigan, I think, we saw a team that got like obliterated on national television.
Not the
And
team of last year, which we all expected, but I mean, not even really formidable in that game. I mean,
yeah,
just and what'd you think of that in general? I mean, I know you were headed down that path, but I just had to say that. I mean, not that we
yeah,
didn't expect a step back, but not
yeah.
impressive.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think what surprised me about it was I expected. I mean, just to put it out there, I have Michigan in the Big Ten championship game. Like that was my preseason
Wow.
prediction,
Wow.
and a big part of it was the defense.
Right.
That's probably what concerned me the most is that this team defensively I mean, they did not stop Texas. I mean, Texas is a phantom hold away from scoring, I think, 4 touchdowns and a field goal and 6 drives in the first half, something like that.
Just crazy.
Yeah, and now part of that,
I'm not saying Texas is terrible either, but
right. Quinn Ewers had a lot to do with that. He was navigating the pocket well and was able to step up, make throws. But you have to remember the running back situation at Texas. They were down to their third and fourth string running backs, and their third stringer got hurt for a major part of the first half. And so they're using their fourth string running back, and they're running on what's supposedly one of the best defensive lines in the country.
Right.
I thought Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Josiah Stewart, who I'm high on all of them, did not play well. The secondary was not great. And I think that was my big takeaway was I think this defense can be really good.
Right.
But the depth, and JR, my co-host on the other show I'm on, Big Ten Huddle, he made a really good point. The depth is not nearly as significant for Michigan, where, Kenneth Grant can't hide anymore.
Right.
He can't go 60, 70 snaps a game. And he can't hide with some of the, the other guys that they had a year ago.
Right.
And I think that's significant. So I think that was my big takeaways. Michigan did not challenge.
Right.
And the defense did not keep them in the game like I thought they would. And Davis Warren, great story, right? Beat leukemia, is now the starter after, I think, walking on, or maybe he earned a scholarship. I'm not sure. But that they wanted Alex Orji to win that job.
Right.
And it's just clear he's like Alex Orji is not good enough as a passer because every time they put him in, it's some sort of QB run. And Davis Warren, I keep seeing people say, "Oh, Davis Warren is a good enough quarterback." No, he's not.
Right.
He's not.
Just
now,
not.
can he grow into it? Maybe. But even if he can, the wide receiver room, that's another train wreck right now. And like Tyler Morris and Samaj Morgan, they're smaller receivers and they're not doing they don't have a great guy on the outside. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think maybe who they miss the most on offense is really, besides JJ McCarthy, is Cornelius Johnson and Roman Wilson. Two very underrated receivers. Roman Wilson went to the second round. And that I think that the fact that they don't have receivers to bail out their quarterback, outside of Colston Loveland, who also just had a bad game.
Bad game all around. And I mean, do you think that part of that feeds off the defense? Do you think it's the culture shock of new coaching? Do you think it's just not being, having that swag and those reliable go-to players that they had the year before? I mean, look, you're going to have that when you have that much turnover, when you have a new coach, you have a new quarterback, you're going to have that. But how much of the all-out really underwhelming for somebody who was more bullish on them to start the year? I mean, where does that start? Is it really a confluence of all of this? Does it come from the defense when you start losing faith in that? Does it come from the defense losing faith and just like, this is a hapless offense? I mean, we don't have the right guy behind center. We don't have the receivers are not stepping up the way we thought they were. The pipeline is not what we thought under this coaching staff. I mean, where does that start? And can, more importantly, Zach, can they rebound and be, are they going to be an upper tier? And I know we have lower tier, the Big Ten. It's such a big conference now. It's hard to really say they're not. But I mean, are they? I mean, are they going to be middling in general? Or are they going to still be there towards the end as they improve in conference play?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll still be nervous on November 30th. That's for sure. But it's a good question. And I think a lot of it really depends on the resolve of the roster and the coaching staff. I do think everything you mentioned is a big piece of it, right? Like, you don't lose Jim Harbaugh and, be what you were. You don't lose 13 starters. You don't lose, 40, I think it was 44 roster spots.
Right.
Like, you don't lose that and not have some sort of effect.
Right.
I think the belief was, well, you have enough big time stars to really get you through. And I don't think anyone was thinking Texas was going to be a win. Right?
Right.
Like, I think
Right.
that the optimism was you get through Texas, you put a good showing in, and then you get through to the next big game, which I think at the time was Oregon,
Mhm.
because, I think, me included, I was not the most high on USC at the time, and you're like, yeah, like, I think Michigan could go 10-2 with the schedule.
Right.
That, you know, their next 4 games are gonna tell us a lot. I mean, they have, Arkansas State, which should be a win, but
Mhm.
then they have USC at home,
Mm.
which, that's now all of a sudden a very interesting game. Minnesota, which we'll talk about Minnesota. I'm not a big PJ Fleck guy, and we can get into that maybe in a
Yeah, I
bit,
kinda
but
talked to him early in the I think he's the wheels, I think, might be coming off at some point. Now, granted, they didn't come off last week, but they weren't
yeah,
expected to. But
yeah.
you have that tough loss week one, and then to get into conference play, I'm not feeling too bullish on them. So I don't know.
Yeah, but it's not a I don't know if it's a gimme right now for Michigan either, and
Right?
I
No.
think the struggle is, can they generate offense?
Mhm.
And, you know, Minnesota's defensively has played very well the first 2 weeks, and so that's something to look out for.
Right.
And then they finished that first 6-game stretch going to Washington, which, Washington also has some things to figure out, but Washington has the benefit of growing and gelling. So if you look at their schedule, they get Washington State this week.
Yes.
That's going to be an interesting game. I have them winning that, but I don't know much about Washington State, if I'm honest. But then
Mhm.
they get Northwestern.
Mhm.
They play at Rutgers. I think
Yes.
that's probably their first loss.
Mhm.
But then, like, they have probably another 2 weeks to kind of gel.
And they're
Whereas,
gonna have to gel, and we knew
yeah,
that about Washington. Gelling would be something early in the season, and as a
yeah,
Rutgers guy, and even objectively speaking, you hope that Rutgers can still catch them in that growth period, and Rutgers is a gelled team already with
yeah,
veterans. But they have a couple weeks to put that together. So
yeah. And so, like, Michigan has to travel to Washington. I think that's the biggest
mm,
thing about it is, like, you have this stretch of USC, Minnesota, and then you travel to Seattle. And
yes.
that's not a great place to play. And if you can't do anything offensively, like, that's all of a sudden a very dangerous game.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested. I won't make a prediction on it, but we're gonna learn a lot about Michigan over the next few weeks, more than I think we thought we would,
Mhm.
because of how they didn't look. I think to wrap up your original question, if I can just go back there
Yeah.
about
Sure.
what does the rest of the league look like? I think what I would say is I think it's very clear that Ohio State is at the top.
Right.
And then I think there's a bunch of teams in that tier below that have either looked just not great,
Mhm.
or you have a group of teams who have looked better than expected and are
Mm,
punching up.
mm.
So, like, I think Rutgers, I still have, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about Kaliak Manis the first 2 weeks, but Rutgers is taking care of business.
Yes.
But before I go on, I'm curious, what have been your thoughts on Kaliak Manis and, like, how Rutgers has gelled the first couple weeks?
So Kaliak Manis the first week I thought was absolutely like he kind of blew me away and take away Howard, take away the competition. Just look at an execution standpoint for him. I thought he was pinpoint threading the needle on every throw the first week. Not only that, but making the right reads in the running game and commanding the huddle, commanding the team. Team clearly has confidence in him. Um, Last Saturday against Akron, you saw an interception. He was drilled when he threw the interception. You saw some, you know, you wondered, right? When he came in, you had previous problems with turnovers last year. Decision making could have been a problem. And you saw some decisions that were a little bit question marky. Even against Akron, we get one pass where he squeezes it into triple coverage in the end zone, gets lucky, it bounces up, and KJ Duff catches it for his first career touchdown as a Scarlet Knight. Second half, he's much more efficient. He hits a deep ball to long down the sideline, and that's hopefully things to come, a 58-yarder, which is one of the things we were missing last year. I'm feeling good about Callie McManus overall. I think
Mhm.
when you get into tougher competition, and our first test is going to be on the road versus Virginia Tech, and then you get into conference play, how consistent is this team going to be in terms of playing complementary football and doing what they want to do? And I say that in terms of in the against Akron, before we got going a little bit better, you saw a defense that was basically stout but had some lapses and they got some injuries. Still some stuff to be desired on one side of that defensive line. Bailey's been out, and he's probably what I thought was going to be our best pass rusher. And you got linebacker injuries, and Jabome, who looked great week one, looked not as great, and that's okay. He's got growing pains. But what I mean is, are you going to have a stout defense, and are you going to be able to rely on Kyle Monunga? And Monunga is just going off absolutely already. I think it was
Yep.
over 300 yards already, just absolutely dominant both games. But when
Yep.
teams that are capable of zeroing in do zero in on Kyle, and I don't ever see Kyle, getting stopped 3 yards behind the line of scrimmage, play in and play out. But if you can limit him and you're able to put points on the board, or you're able to make a big play here or there on our defense. We had a blown coverage on a blitz against Akron. Are we going to be able to play that balanced complementary football? And if we're not able to do that, or if we have to rely more heavily on Athan, is Athan going to come through and continue to protect the ball? Now, I'm not worried that he's not going to be able to make big plays. I'm confident in his arm, confident in his playmaking ability, especially with our wide receivers.
Mhm.
And they've not gotten the best separation play in and play out, but they've done their job so far.
Yeah.
Um, but if you can't, how if you're pushing him into a situation where the game's on his shoulders, can you rely on him to protect the football the way Rutgers wants to protect the football? Shiano says the ball is the program. He's not necessarily a gunslinger, but just some of the things you see, he's still got to protect that football and not make mistakes. I'm still feeling confident. But I think just like with everything, as confident as I am, and I still have my prediction of 9-3, I think the wins and losses line up pretty well. We'll see what happens, quite frankly, what I predicted. But reality sets in. Reality is never as rosy as your brightest daydream. And I'm still confident, but you're starting to see, as much as you're seeing the strengths, you're seeing some of the drawbacks and some of the issues. So I still put them, especially after seeing, some of the other teams and what you said about some of the other teams, still putting them in that upper, quarter of the league, upper third of the league. But I've seen some things that make me want to see more, and see how things develop with them.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where I'm at with Rutgers too. Like, I think Kaliakmanis has done some good things. I think one thing that's interesting is I feel like every transfer quarterback, and even Will Howard to a degree, like there's an adjustment period, and
Hmm.
I think we've seen it with Dylan Gabriel at Oregon. We see it. We certainly saw it with Max Brosmer the first game.
Hmm.
Mike Wright, who just got benched at Northwestern.
Yeah.
Jack Lausch is getting the start next week against, I think, Eastern Illinois. But like it is tough for these transfers to come in, and like Athan has an advantage, like he's reunited with Kurt Soraka.
Yes.
Um, but even that, like that was something that really stood out to me even week one, which gets to my, I think, two teams that are really rising in the Big Ten. Um, a lot of the transfer quarterbacks were maybe struggling a little bit, or even if they weren't struggling, maybe the people around them were, because they're still adjusting to the quarterback.
Makes sense. Yeah.
The one guy that didn't, Luke Altmaier out of Illinois,
Hmm.
has played very well.
Bit of a revelation with Illinois. Bit of a
Yeah.
revelation where, especially us and, the schedule towards the end. Oh, Illinois, that's a win. And this, I mean, Illinois has emerged a little bit looking much stronger than I think a lot of people had anticipated.
Yeah, I mean that win against Kansas, it's a big deal,
Hmm.
and that defense looks like 2 years ago,
Yeah.
and that should put everybody on notice, because that defense, it held Michigan. They almost upset Michigan, I think on the road, uh, 2 years ago. It might have been at home. I can't remember, but they are explosive defensively. And Altmaier, I've said if he's got the tools to be an upper half quarterback, and now he knows the system better, he's more in control. I think they have a good running back in Caden Fagan. Their team, Nebraska, obviously. I mean, they could have named the score against Colorado.
Well,
It was
I was gonna ask you about Nebraska. I mean, Raiola looks as advertised. What was your thoughts on Nebraska? Colorado, they have their issues. I mean, and
yeah,
I saw that game. I saw the whole game, but Nebraska looking like it's kind of ascending the way we thought they might be ascending, and that they're going
yeah,
to be a little bit of a problem there.
yeah. And I think the thing that's great about them is they don't have to rely on Raiola.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of the reason why they beat Colorado. Well, one, Colorado stinks.
Yeah, they're just
They're
they're not it.
terrible.
Yeah,
They're so bad.
yeah,
And that's all I have to say about that. But no, like they ran the ball, they played good defense. And you look at Nebraska last year, everybody was saying same old with Nebraska. And I'm like, no, their quarterback room is not good. And
right,
if you just get semi adequate quarterback play last year, they're a bowl team. And I think Raiola made some not good decisions. Like, I think the last touchdown should have been a pick, and instead it's a touchdown.
right,
It wouldn't have mattered because Colorado was so bad. But the reality is Matt Rule is doing a great job of not putting too much on him, but also giving him enough to do, which that's
right,
a really delicate balance, but they have the roster to do that. They have a good running back in Dowdell. They have good lines. Tommy Hill at corner is the corner or linebacker. I always forget, but really great player on defense. And this is a team. I mean, you want to talk about a fun slate of games now for Nebraska. They play Illinois in 2 weeks.
that's
It
fun. Yeah,
that'll most likely be a game of two top 25 teams because
yeah,
Nebraska's ranked. Illinois was receiving votes, like the top
uh,
team receiving votes without being ranked. That'll be a ranked top 25 matchup. They get Rutgers October 5th.
mm-hmm.
That'll be I mean, if Rutgers beats Virginia Tech on the road, which that looks more
Yes,
likely now, and they play Washington, that could be a top 25 matchup.
right.
You look at, and then they get a bye. 2 weeks later, they play Ohio State. Then they play USC. I mean, they have some big time matchups, and you're talking about a team that's a dark horse to go 10-2. Like if they get to 10-2, they're in the playoff.
Oh yeah, which is crazy. Now that's a lot. A lot has to happen between now and
Yes,
then to get
yeah,
to
a lot
10.
has to happen, but
But
yeah, that's where they're at right now.
and I think people are, they are ascending. So I don't think it's totally out of the ordinary.
Yeah.
Who else? Any other unexpected ascension? I mean, now Nebraska's not unexpected. Illinois a little bit unexpected. Maybe Michigan. I think like minds could agree or disagree on Michigan and where they thought they'd be. Anybody else that you think is looking better than you thought or worse than you thought that jumps out?
I think you got to give Michigan State props for winning the
I was going to
first,
talk about the only
Big
conference game,
Ten.
Maryland.
Yeah, they beat Maryland, which good old Mike Locksley underperforming when you need him most.
What else to do? Yes.
Yeah, people on my show know I have a love-hate relationship with Mike Locksley. He doesn't know about it, but I do. But I think Michigan State to go on the road and win that game, I think says a lot about Jonathan Smith as a coach. And Aiden Childs has not had a good first couple games, but for him to hang in there, to have a game tying touchdown to Nick Marsh, that does wonders for quarterback's confidence. And people have to remember, he came in with a lot of fanfare from Oregon State.
Mm-hmm.
He's really raw. He's really young, and they don't necessarily have the running game. Like they have a okay running game, but they don't have a dominating running game. And so like a lot of it's been on his shoulders. Looked terrible week 1. threw 3 picks week 2, but they were able to survive it, and
Right.
that does a lot for a quarterback's confidence, especially a young quarterback to throw that many picks and then come back and win a game.
Right.
And I think that says a lot about him and his potential. And I think it also speaks volumes to Jonathan Smith as a coach, because I think, quite frankly, Michigan State coming into the season was probably the second or third worst team in the conference.
Yeah, I think everyone
And
thought so. Yeah.
yeah, and I don't think Maryland's going to be all that great this year, but it's still a road win in the Big Ten, and that counts. And it's certainly not something that I picked, and so I think that's big. I'll give you one more team that I am very curious about, especially given the Notre Dame upset last week, which is Purdue.
Mm-hmm.
Purdue's got a rough schedule.
Mm-hmm.
They might go 4-8 and be much better than a year ago.
Right.
But I'll go on record here. I think Purdue beats Notre Dame this week.
I mean, it's it's possible.
Yeah.
You got the in-state thing there, and you know, it's possible for
Yeah.
sure.
Hudson Card. I think Hudson Card, like Luke Altmaier, is very underrated in this league
I think you
as a
said that
quarterback.
early before the season even started, Zach, if I remember.
Yes. Yeah. I'm very high on him. They've had a bye week
Mhm.
to get ready for Notre Dame. And now I'm sure they're like, hey, Northern Illinois beat this team. We can beat them too.
Yeah.
I think Ryan, the key for them, I want to see Ryan Walters' defense in year 2 and how they've gelled. They've got an elite safety in Dylan Thieneman in the back end. I think their defensive line looked better than expected week 1. Granted, they didn't play great competition, but I more and more I think Purdue looks, I think, like a team that maybe could go bowling despite their schedule. Their schedule's insane.
And that's a shame for them sometimes.
Yeah.
Coming out of that West, now they have to deal with the schedule like they have.
Yeah, and I'll give props to their crosstown rival Indiana too. They played a glorified high school team last week in Western
Mhm.
Illinois.
Mhm.
But for Indiana Hoosiers, for them to see 77 points, doesn't matter who you play. Like,
True.
they haven't seen that in, I don't know if they've seen it ever.
Yeah, we're
That's not
talking
a
about football, not basketball, so
right, right. And it continues to add to I think, the momentum that Indiana is trying to build, which, remember, Indiana was easily the worst team in the conference a year ago.
Oh, yeah.
And they have a big game. People might laugh at this. They have a big game at UCLA. And I say it's big for 2 reasons. One, UCLA had a bye,
Mhm.
and it's at UCLA. And
Right.
so, you know, I before the preseason, I picked UCLA to win this game, and I'm probably going to pick them again because they're home and
Right.
they've had a bye week, despite the fact how bad they looked.
Yes.
But week 1 to week 2 plus a bye week, I think, and then traveling to Hawaii, it messes with you. So I'm very curious. No one's gonna watch that game thinking, "Oh, this is the Big Ten game of the week."
Right, of course not.
But I think it's a very intriguing game in that you now have a Power 5 team to go up against in UCLA, who's got guys. Like, they're
Mhm.
not devoid of talent, and Indiana is trying to ascend to that next level.
Yes.
What happens in that game?
Right.
But I don't know if Indiana's ascending necessarily, but I think that game will help tell us a lot about both teams.
To piggyback off that, I mean, this week we got a slate of games. Rutgers is not playing, obviously, but what games, if you're a Big Ten fan and you're looking for, something interesting that's conference related, what couple games, like, what 2 or 3 games are you keeping an eye on this weekend that folks should pay attention to?
Well, I think Ross-Ade, Purdue, hosting Notre Dame is
Mhm.
really intriguing. It is I think it's CBS. It's a
Okay.
3:30 kick. Brad Nessler, Gary Danielson on the call, um, and I think the matchup really is, how does Purdue's defense do against an offense that's really struggled for Notre Dame,
Mhm.
and can Hudson Card continue to ascend? Game one, I think he was 24-25. Like, can't do much better than that,
No.
right? Can he do it against a better defense?
Right.
And Notre Dame is not going to be like, I don't think they're going to sleepwalk. I don't think it was just a sleepwalk issue against Northern Illinois. Like, they just got beat.
But you can be assured they will not sleepwalk one way or
Yeah,
the other.
they will be on high alert, I
Yeah.
think. And so I think how does Notre Dame respond to that? And can Purdue go into the game with confidence and not arrogance, being like, "Oh, this team just lost to Northern Illinois." And like, how does Ryan Walters really get them ready for that? But I think Hudson Card can be dangerous. Remember, he was a former high recruit at Texas, transferred because of Quinn Ewers. This guy can play.
Yeah.
And I think that's intriguing. I think Oregon State is another one. Oregon should have lost against Boise State, if I'm being completely honest. 2 special teams touchdowns saved them.
Crazy.
And remember, they scored 37 against Boise State. 14 of those points are special teams, not offense. And so I don't think Oregon State is as good as Boise State. I think Boise State is actually a pretty good team this year.
Right.
But you got to go on the road. It's 2 weeks in a row that you have really not played well and looked pretty disjointed. I have them on very much on upset alert this week. And I don't know if I'm going to pick that. And then I'll say Washington State, again, big time rivalry. And then I think a game that will tell us more about Wisconsin is Wisconsin Alabama. That's obviously like the big non-conference game. Alabama struggled a bit last week. I think Alabama, they kind of do this every year. And I know it's Kalen DeBoer now and not Nick Saban, but Kalen DeBoer is a pretty good coach. And for everything I've seen out of Wisconsin thus far, I mean, they've struggled. I mean, they were losing to Western Michigan in the fourth quarter, and then they struggled with South Dakota. And I think what I've been alarmed by is defensively, they've been okay.
Right.
And offensively, they do nothing super well. Like, Tyler Van Dyke has not been good.
Right.
Ches Malusi, who I think is a really good back, he hasn't had a lot of holes to run through. Like, they just have not
Which
been
is
great
such
in
a
the running game.
revelation for that program.
Yeah.
But you
And
said they were going through a transition offensive philosophy and whatnot, and it might not fit as well on them this year.
Yeah. Well, and I'm concerned, Larry. Like, I love Luke Fickell, former Ohio State player, former Ohio State coach. So I obviously have a lot of love for him. But I was just talking with TJ Burkle out of Common Fan, the Nebraska podcast for the College Huddle, and we were questioning, is he Wisconsin's version of Scott Frost? Because he came in with a lot of hype, a lot of fanfare. Is like, we're going to change everything. We're going to do all this stuff. And I'm like, man, you guys, like, I don't know if you're going bowling this year. Now they can get it together, right? It'd be great for them to get it together against Alabama, but this is a measuring stick game for them. Like, what do they do against one of the top teams in the country? If they can hang with Alabama, my tune changes immediately. And I'm not saying upset Alabama. I'm saying if they're within 10 points by the end of the game, like, my tune changes. Obviously, if they upset Alabama, it's like, okay, I like them.
Well, of course.
Yeah. But I and I don't know if you've seen them or watched them, or if you have thoughts about Wisconsin.
Not much. I think only from what I've kind of read in the after the games and just perusing a little bit. But I haven't seen anything or read anything that would lead me to disagree with your assessment there in general. I mean, I predicted for Rutgers a loss at Nebraska, but then a win at home against Wisconsin. And I think for some of the reasons you're putting forth, I mean, last year got out of control for a couple of reasons, but I don't necessarily think they were the Wisconsin of old already last year, so their trajectory really wasn't uh, necessarily trending in a great direction this year as it is. So,
Yeah.
uh, interested to hear that that's how they are. From your perspective right now. If they
Yeah.
show something against Bama, that's one thing, but um, if it's an absolute bloodbath, then it's really not. We know
Yeah.
that it's solidified. It's not the Wisconsin of old.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So,
Give me your, for a big picture thing. I know it's early, and I know it probably hasn't changed all that much from the beginning of the season. But you able to give a top five right now in the Big Ten? From your perspective, like a little mini power ranking.
oh
Off.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think Ohio State 1, USC 2. I think
Mhm.
that's probably the easiest.
And all that
Uh
hype about USC maybe not fitting into the conference that well and having some weakness and
yeah.
and being a little soft doesn't look like it's coming to fruition after that LSU
Yeah.
game too, does it? I mean, they withstood what they had to, came out with the W, have looked as advertised.
Yes. Yes. And I think if they continue to gel, they will have a lot to say about the Big Ten race and the
Hmm.
playoff.
Hmm.
But they still have a tough schedule, and they go to Michigan, they play Penn State. Uh, and they travel, or no, they don't travel as much as Oregon does. They play Nebraska, they play Notre Dame, and I know Notre Dame. Everybody's making fun of Notre Dame this week, but Marcus Freeman has made a living off of beating the teams he's not supposed to beat and then losing to the teams that they're not supposed to lose to. But I think Ohio State USC is a clear 1 and 2. And I think you got to give Penn State credit for beating West Virginia on the road. And I think their ceiling is honestly, I think their ceiling is probably a little higher right now than USC.
Hmm.
So, but I have them 3 just on the merit of you can't let Connor Bazelak do that to you. You can't let Bowling Green do that to you, right? So I've got them at 3. I've got Nebraska all the way up to
Mm.
4.
Mm.
And a lot of that is because Michigan was in my top 5 and they looked I'm like, I don't know if Michigan beats Nebraska if they play that the way they did last week.
I could see, right.
Yeah, and then Iowa's another one. We didn't talk about Iowa. You
Yeah,
want
we
to talk about
didn't.
choke job. And we could, talk a lot about who's to blame for that game, but I'll say this: Iowa State deserves a lot of credit, and they have a lot more firepower than I realized. They're
Mhm.
going to be a Big 12 contender for sure.
Right.
But I've got Nebraska at 4, and then Oregon at 5.
Hmm.
But I have Oregon at 5 because I don't know who else to put there right now. Because I
Gotcha.
think
Right.
Iowa, Michigan are probably not like I don't know if I'd trust them against Oregon, but I'm not so sure if Illinois and Rutgers played Oregon today. Like I'm not sure that Oregon wins.
Right, and that's
Eh,
what I was going to say. That little handful there is interesting for that 5 spot.
yeah. And
Got to by default put Oregon.
yeah, and I think
Early.
part of it is who is on the roster.
Hmm.
If that roster gels, and that's the big thing. If Dan Lanning can turn this ship around and say, "Hey, you guys got to play for each other. You guys got to, play disciplined and sharp." I mean, they are the second best roster in the Big Ten,
Hmm.
but they have not played like it, and they can't keep playing like this
Right.
because they will get beat starting this week. Like they play like if they keep playing like this, they will stack losses for sure.
Right. Right.
Um, so that's why I have them at 5. And I think, Iowa, like I'm not going to ding Iowa too much for losing to Iowa State. I think that's a really good team. And
Hmm.
I think they blew it
Hmm.
more than I think they blew it as much as Iowa State won it.
Hmm.
I think Michigan still has a lot of top end talent that you can't just ignore them.
Can't ignore them. No, you
Yeah.
you can't.
So, and then
Especially if they gel.
Illinois Rutgers kind of rounds out my top half.
Okay. Okay. So we got Ohio State, USC, Penn State, Nebraska, and then Oregon for you for the top 5.
Yeah.
No,
Yep.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense. Anything else you're waiting? I mean, are you looking to see? You think it's going to be a USC Ohio State? Do they play? They play each other this year, so it could
No.
be that could be a championship.
Yeah, so I feel it's funny. I want to see USC do it again
Mm-hmm.
before I would say USC is definitely gonna make the and
Right.
again, it's week 2. I still feel that way about Ohio State, right? Like, now Ohio State, I think, is a more sure thing, but, talk to me after they play Iowa,
Right.
in this case, talk to me after they play Michigan State. Not that I think Michigan State's gonna challenge them,
But
but,
I get
like,
it. More of a test, a litmus test to really see glean a little bit more.
yeah, like, I
USC,
wanna
we've seen at least against some teams here, or one team. But
yeah, and so I think but I wanna see them do it, again, championships aren't one you glean a lot in week 2,
mm-hmm.
but we still don't know a lot, and I think that's the thing. Like, I think there's questions of who is Penn State.
Mm-hmm.
Are they more the team they that played West Virginia? Are they more the team that played, uh, Bowling Green? I think the best version of Penn State gives USC and Ohio State, uh, problems, and,
Right.
they play Ohio State at home. They have to go on the road to the Coliseum, but, if this defense can play up to snuff, that'll be the toughest defense that I think USC plays this
Right.
season. So that's a good game. Does Nebraska continue to ascend? Like, how much can they put on Rayola? And, just because Iowa blew it, can Tim Lester continue to help that offense evolve? Because if Iowa's offense can be first half Iowa against Iowa State,
Yes.
like that's a dangerous team.
Right.
And I don't know if they can get there because I think Cade McNamara, once he threw a pick, like, he really reverted. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much of that was him. I don't know how much of that was Tim Lester. I don't know how much of that is Kirk Ferentz.
Mm-hmm.
And so I I think there's a big question mark around Iowa, um, that I think, they in their schedule is not it's not hard. And they could still go 7-1 in the league or 8-1 in the league and make the Big Ten championship game. So,
Right.
like, Iowa's out there lurking if they can get things together on offense. And then Michigan looked terrible, but if they pull through these next few games,
All of a
and
sudden, it's a different outlook. Yeah.
yeah,
And a
but
different calculation for everybody with them on the schedule, too.
yeah, but so I think you asked me, is Ohio State USC? I think it's a big question mark. I think there's an outside shot Rutgers gets in. There's an outside shot that I think Illinois, if that defense plays the way it does, throughout the season, like, and some of these teams don't get it together, like, I think you could see Illinois make a run. I
Right.
wouldn't predict it, but, like, I think the middle of here's probably my biggest takeaway. I think the middle of the Big Ten is bigger than I expected.
Mm. Mm.
Where I expected the top to be maybe more solidified, but I would argue that maybe Ohio State's in a tier on its own right now. USC and Penn State are maybe in a tier below that. But, like, you go from Nebraska to I mean, I might even say Minnesota.
Mm.
And you're like, I'm not sure that any of these teams don't, like, have a fighting chance week in and week out against each other, which is not what I would have expected preseason.
Yeah, I think I saw a good amount of parity in some of the schedules, especially with the infusion of new teams, the unknowns about a bunch of teams, the lack of consistency in scheduling because you don't have the two divisions anymore and everybody's got a different schedule. So I'm not super surprised that there's a lot of parity in that middle range there. But
Yeah.
I do think, too, if we were to talk, at a different juncture, a few more weeks in, we might have more clarity one way or the other. Some guys maybe not. Some you could see some wacky results, but maybe some teams you get a little more clarity. So it's going to be interesting to follow. But I understand where you're coming from now, especially, and I understand how things kind of adjust after seeing a few weeks. And it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, it's just a brand new frontier with the Big Ten this year, and it's going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
Zach,
go
ahead.
And I'll just say this. I think the thing to watch out for is if Oregon and Michigan can get their act together, like that, and that's why I think the middle to that point too, like the parity. I don't think people expected Oregon and Michigan to look, and Iowa to an extent too, to look like they have. But if particularly Oregon and Michigan get it figured out, then all of a sudden the top becomes a lot more interesting again.
Right.
And, especially Oregon. And so, sorry, I cut you off.
No, but that's fine. And I mean, obviously that the top gets much more interesting, and then the teams that have to go against them get more interesting, and you have a little bit more of a defined pecking order there for jostling for bowl games and for standings and for things like that. So going to be an interesting year, which we thought, but hopefully we'll get a little more clarity, and we'll have you back on to talk about it. And I'll pop on obviously to talk about that and Rutgers and their trajectory here. But Zach, I mean, bye week for us. Great to hear about league-wide stuff. Where can people hear more of your show? Tell them where they can get it. Where's the best place to get it? What you're going to be talking about this week? What you're normally on the schedule? If people are interested in just getting more of a wide view of the Big Ten, I know I tune into you because I got to time manage, and I'm like, what is Zach saying? I got to know what the hell's going on in this conference besides just sitting in my seats over here in Jersey. So let them know, where can they find you and what can they expect?
Yeah, so you guys can find me at Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Particularly, there's a few other places, but if you're going to check us out, really, Apple, Spotify, and YouTube are the three places. And right now, it's Monday mornings. We do recaps. Thursday mornings, I post kind of picks, and I'm trying to find different College Huddle members to be with me on the pick shows. So this week, Eric from the OHIO podcast is coming on, Dylan from the Boiler Express, and we're going to talk about week 3 together. Obviously, Larry, you did week 1 with me, which was a ball. But yeah, that's kind of our normal rhythm. And yeah, definitely check it out, like and subscribe. It's been a fun journey. And the other thing I'll say is I get to be on the Big Ten Huddle as well with JR, who's great, really great mind for the whole league as well. So we go live Sunday nights and Tuesday nights, and he's live Thursday nights as well. But you can catch both of us on there as well on YouTube. So.
And so they just type in Big Ten football talk, right? Because for the people that are listening to the audio version, Big Ten football talk, and find you and get to listening and get educated, folks. And look for me on there and look for Zach on my channel. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, I was gonna say too. I love fan interaction. So, and actually, Rutgers fans have been some of my favorite interactions. So, Sean, I think Sean Morosi, one of your listeners, he got us connected, but he was just commenting on something I said I think today, or whenever this post on Monday.
Yep.
And I love it. So find me on X, email me at big10footballtalk@gmail.com as well. So
yeah, reach out to my man Zach, guys. I hope you enjoyed this show. I hope I gave you some good content for the bye week. A lot to ponder in the Big Ten, a lot to think about, a lot more clarity or a lot less clarity, depending on how these next few weeks go, to happen in this conference. And we'll have Zach back on to kind of give us the state of the conference. Zach, I'll probably ask you to come back on maybe at intervals, 2/3 through the season and towards the end of the season, to just discuss the league-wide stuff and inform the people who listen to my show over here a little bit more of a league-wide look. So I really, really appreciate your time, appreciate you coming on, and absolutely appreciate your valuable insight around the league.
Well, I appreciate it, man. It's always a joy to get to do this with you. So Rutgers fans, you guys have a gem in Larry. So it's really fun. So appreciate you, man.
Appreciate that, brother. Talk to you guys soon. And remember, click subscribe on Night Watch. You can find us on all major podcast platforms. Looking forward to talking to you guys again very soon. Go Knights and keep an eye on the Big Ten.